Our first speaker today is Clodagh Crehan from the Food Safety Authority of Ireland. She's a senior technical executive in regulatory affairs, which covers a broad range of issues such as food legislation, particularly food labelling, which I'm sure baffles us all sometimes anyway. I find myself often standing in the supermarket trying to make head nor tail of it. And she holds a BSc in nutritional science and an MSc in food technology. And prior to joining the Food Safety Authority, she worked as a nutritionist with Superquinn and a scientist with Teagasc. So I'm delighted to welcome Clodagh to talk to us about this.
Thanks very much, Jackie, and thanks to Aoife as well. Thank you for inviting me along to speak to you all this morning. I'm going to try now and have a bash at sharing the slides that I have prepared. So hopefully, can you see those on screen? Great. Okay, so I suppose it's certainly an interesting topic when we get into science, and it's very interesting to listen to David there. And I suppose for me today, I'm coming from a background, sorry, I'll just put it into the full screen. I'm coming from the background of the regulatory side. So sometimes I won't say clashes, but we have to look at what is required. Sorry, now I'm going to try and put it into full screen mode. Okay. So there we go, full screen. So as I said, we're coming from the regulatory side, and as Jackie introduced me, my background in FSAI is in regulatory affairs, so it covers all of the different pieces of food legislation right across the board. But obviously for today, the subject that I'm going to look at is food labelling. And coming from the regulatory point, I do want to go through, what is the mandatory information, what are on food labels, and try to give a background to some of the key points. But at the same time, rather than turning this into a labelling presentation as such, because as you said, Jackie, labelling is just the piece of legislation that keeps on giving, and it's never clear cut. It's such a huge piece of legislation. There are so many exemptions and derogations, so that really, when we're tasked with having a look at, any information on a food label, there's so many different, parts that we must look at. So I want to try today to tie the regulatory piece alongside, how the information is used by food businesses, by, product developers, so that then they're marketing their food in a certain way. So we'll kick off and have a look, just a quick introduction to the FSAI for those of you who don't know much about us. We are a food law enforcement body. We're an independent body set up under the Food Safety Authority of Ireland Act. But the key thing here, and that ties nicely in with the theme today, is that we are science-based. So our decisions would be science-based, and it would encapsulate so much of the research and the work on all the different various subjects. Obviously, we have the point, we have the role of enforcing the legislation, but in that said, we also have a role in preparing and providing support and guidance to allow for compliance building, so that food businesses are aware of their obligations. And I suppose it's not the easiest read when you take up a piece of food legislation. So by engaging with the various industry groups, whether we have a retail forum, an artisan forum, and food service forum, and many others, it's just a way for us to be able to communicate and to ensure that the rules are met. So if we get into the theme now of food labelling, just a very quick brief on how it's all decided, because again, from time to time we will get, and if it's like we've had the mention of, we'll hear about sugar and sugar consumption later. Consumers will have various different needs or interests in terms of food and the composition of food. So obviously there are certain things they might want to see on labels, or maybe they don't like them presented in certain ways. And so just in terms of the background, the legislation comes from Europe. So the European Commission will propose a piece of legislation that then would have to go to, it will be shared between the European Council and the European Parliament. Each of the member states involved would have representation. So ourselves, along with the Department of Health, would attend these meetings so we can input in terms of any of the particular aspects of each of the pieces of legislation. So it's a very lengthy process. It doesn't happen overnight, but at the end of the day, it's all about the Commission looking after the member states towards having a consistent approach to the food rules. And so for food labelling, just very briefly for anybody interested in getting more information, the particular piece of legislation that looks after the labelling of pre-packed foods is what we refer to as FIC. It's Food Information to Consumers, and that's Regulation 1169 of 2011. I've also flagged here, we have a specific piece of legislation again from Europe, and it covers nutrition and health claims, which we'll see a little bit later in my presentation. And just really then to just, let you know that as well as the European legislation, which may be in the form of a regulation or a directive, there's also the opportunity for member states to introduce their own national rules. So we would have done that for each of the 2 pieces of legislation that I've referred to there. So just then a question to throw out there: who reads food labels? And again, the information I have here on the date on the screen, it's old enough in terms of it's 2009 information. We would have gone out to do a survey back in December 2009 to gather information to bring to the table when the new FIC, food information legislation, was coming about. So that piece of legislation was published in 2011. So as part of our information gathering, we set about to see, well, who reads the labels? What are they looking for on labels? And interestingly enough, when we look at it, yes, we can see there's a good span of the respondents who usually would or always did look at labels. But we found that 27% of the respondents never looked at a food label. Now, I suspect, as I said, it is older piece of information. I suspect if we were to do that now, and if we were to ask the same question now, I think we would see a lot more people who read food labels. There's a whole change in the dynamic of the way people are choosing food, picking foods, if it's to do with maybe higher protein foods. There's a whole different subset of food groups, if you like, that people are following. So I suspect, as I said, that this research, this information, if we were to do it again, would change with more people looking at the labels. And just to tie on with that then, the Food Standards Agency back in 2016, this is the Food Standards Agency Northern Ireland, they also followed up with some research and also had a look at to see, well, why do people not read the labels? And again, things like you're familiar with buying the same things. And again, that is true. As a shopper myself, I know you go in to buy the same things. However, I think there's probably a change again, and even considering our lockdown and our COVID, it became the highlight to go to the supermarket at one stage. So I think people are more aware of the types of foods. They tend to read the labels. And of course, we have a population that have to read food labels for certain allergens and to avoid consumption of certain foods. So again, the research here showed that the attention is driven for certain consumers because of particular information they needed. So as I said, the allergen, or if it was a specific diet. And then outside of that, it really fell back to looking at the use by dates and the best before. But there's so much more information that has to be on a food label. And I've listed the 11 points that fall out of FIC, the Regulation 1169. And again, as I said, if we were to go through each of these points individually, each one of these have other provisions and very specific requirements. So as I said, for today, that's not what my objective is. It's to really just highlight to you that this is the information that needs to be on a food label. It's mandatory information. Yes, there are some of the derogations, but that would be very specific to food products. In terms then of, why should we read labels and what are the key influencers? So for the respondents that had been always looking or pretty much always looking at labels, obviously the use by and best before date, and they're 2 separate declarations. A use by date is something, it's on products that have a short shelf life that would be likely to cause an illness after a certain period of time. A best before date would be on foods like your dry goods, cereals and biscuits that could go on pretty much indefinitely. They'll go stale, they're not a safety risk. As I mentioned already, people will look for the allergen information because obviously that's a safety issue. There's also origin declaration. That's a huge topic now, that food consumers are more interested in to know where their food has come from. And then I suppose we can tie the next 2 together, the nutrition information and nutrition and health claims, because again, the consumer wants to know the nutrition profile of the food they're buying and if there's any benefits to it. So I'm just going to look very briefly at some of these. The allergens, the legislation FIC lists 14 allergens or category of allergens that if any of these are present in the ingredient declaration, you use it in your recipe, they have to be highlighted on your label in a way that distinguishes that ingredient from all others. So whether it seems to be the rule of thumb that industry have chosen to use bolding that particular ingredient, there could be any other way of doing it. But the key thing is that if I as a consumer go to the supermarket, I pick up a food product, on the ingredient declaration, I can clearly see the allergen that I may need to avoid. Okay. The origin labeling is a bit of a tricky one. The rule of thumb with origin on food labels is that you don't have to give an origin unless its absence would mislead the consumer. So what we mean here is that, yes, we have a certain section of foods that under their own product specific legislation, they need to have origin on there. For example, beef has to give you the origin, honey, and there are some other pieces of legislation. But under the general labelling legislation under FIC, if you don't mislead your consumer in any way, so there's no colour scheme, no flags, no representation on that label, and your food doesn't fall into the product-specific legislation requiring origin, you don't have to give it. However, if we move on and you start to put a colour scheme on there, if you start to give any emblems on the label that now lead the consumer on to believe it's an Irish product, when in actual fact it was either imported or none of the ingredients used are Irish, well, in that case, we're into the category of being misleading, and that's something that we would be following up to enforce. And just very briefly to say that there are separate origin rules now that require the origin not only on beef, but on any fresh or frozen meat from pigs, sheep, goats, and poultry. So if you go to the supermarket now and you pick up chicken fillets or pork chops, you will see the origin of that meat on its own. When that meat is used in another, whether it's a stir fry or any other type of product that you buy as a chilled product, it's outside the scope of these rules. So you can see how the number of rules start to add on. There's an accumulation of legislation. And again, just to very briefly mention that there are rules since 2018 in place that you have to give the origin of the primary ingredient. So if you go to your supermarket this evening and you pick up a chicken curry, and the label may indicate to you, well, you know, it has a lovely colour scheme, it looks Irish, this looks like a good product. You must ensure then, as the business operator, that the chicken that you used in that curry is also Irish. And if it's not, well, then you have to give the origin of the chicken. So remember, all of this comes back to food information to the consumer. You have to provide them with what they need to know. In terms of the nutrition declaration, then here is the legal minimum in terms of what has to be on a food label. Again, it's providing the consumer with the nutritional profile. It has to be in this order of nutrients, and the declaration must also be given per 100 grams or 100 mils. Now, the FIC legislation allows additionally to put voluntary information in terms of portion size, reference intakes, so that you can relate back to how much you should be consuming of each nutrient per day. But this is the legal minimum table. So you will see this table as a definite. You may see some other nutrients included as supplementary nutrients. So you'll see maybe fibre, you'll see vitamins and minerals. And if you see vitamins and minerals labelled in the nutrition declaration, you will definitely have to see the absolute amount, but you'll also see the reference intake, because they can be so tiny in micrograms that you need to be able to relate that to how much you should be consuming of that vitamin and mineral. So that's just a quick kind of step on some of the key points in terms of mandatory labelling. What I want to have a look at now, that all falls under the food information to consumers. It's what has to be given. And so I suppose I just want to bring up some, points on food marketing. So we're looking at food information versus food marketing. If we were to look at the cartons of milk and the carton of juice, if you were to go to the supermarket and see that white carton on the shelf and maybe the shelf talker in front to tell you it's milk or it's orange juice, it's not exactly, grabbing your attention. However, you can see then that the more that, and you'll see this from looking at labels yourselves in the supermarket, the more information, the more colour that's put on food labels, it's attracting the consumer eye. But what we have to be mindful, and again, coming back to the regulatory piece from the FSAI side, is that what you put on this information, it's voluntary. You're adding extra information for your consumer outside of what's the mandatory declaration, and so you must fall within the scope of what you're permitted to do. So the likes of things like premium quality, farm fresh, there's so many, I couldn't list them all. You will see so many different words on food labels that sometimes you might say to yourself, well, what does that actually mean? And if the label doesn't provide you with a description to help assist you, you really aren't any better off in terms of, but it looks good. So just take a look at this one here. It's how about natural carrots? They're guaranteed natural. Well, of course they're guaranteed natural, because all carrots are going to be grown. There's nothing you can do to the carrot to allow it to still be called a carrot. And again, when you see something like this on a label, to see that it's natural, my first thing to say, well, have I ever seen an unnatural carrot? Or indeed, when I see natural on labels, whether it's a compound, a composite food that has many other ingredients, my key question is, well, did it grow on a tree or was it picked somewhere? And the answer is no. So you have to be very careful that you can't use the word natural in something that has many different ingredients, but you may then, on the other hand, be able to say made with natural ingredients, so that your ingredients that went into whatever the food product is. So these are just little kind of, I suppose, buzz terms to think about. Here are some other ones. I mentioned natural, traditional, farmhouse, artisan. So again, if you're going to use any of these terms, they're not legislated for because they're not defined in FIC. However, we have produced some guidance to try and support the industry to provide, I suppose, specifics and criteria that you can use these terms once your food product can meet the criteria. So you can see that it can't just be a kind of a throwaway, that you know, the challenge between those in the food industry that are in the regulatory team versus those that are marketing, I can imagine they're interesting conversations, but at the end of the day, what you put on the food label has to be legal and it can't mislead the consumer. And like that, I mentioned the whole traditional, you'll see we have two signs here, traditional Irish pizza and traditional Irish stew. I don't think an Irish pizza is anything traditional. And again, in the criteria that goes with being traditional is that you would have to have that tradition being 30 years old as a minimum. So again, these are the kind of things that I suppose those labeling foods as a marketeer maybe don't really think about. But obviously these are the kind of things that from our side we have to pick up on. I'm not going to go through, there's a lot of information on this slide, but I really just want to flag that again under FIC Article 7, it lists out all of the ways that you could mislead the consumer. You can do so through any of the characteristics of the food, and I suppose we've probably looked at some of those now. If you claim or if you give any property to your food that the food doesn't actually have, or if you emphasize a special characteristic to your food when in actual fact all other similar foods on the market, other brands have exactly the same characteristic, well again you can't make that link. So again, I just thought this was quite a nice little label here about the free range baby potatoes. We plant them in the fields and they choose not to run away, so they're free range. So again, you know, you can come up with any amount of wording as the food business operator labeling, but again we have to always bring it back to Article 7 of FIC. So again, just to, as I said, as our role as the FSAI, we're also there to provide guidance and support. And this is just one particular document, Guidance Note 29, the use of food marketing terms, which is really helpful that if any food business was looking to label their foods with any of those terms, traditional, artisan, etc., that they will find the guidance there. Again, I'm due to wrap up. I've only a few more slides here, but again, I just want to emphasize, and I think this is something that's forgotten as well, is that, you know, the trend now is towards online sales. We have seen this through COVID, that businesses have to change their way, you know, to keep going, you know, through social media and online sales. So the same rules apply. So it doesn't matter if you're not having any contact with your customer, the same thing, the information that has to be on the pre-packed food still has to be on the food that you're selling online, but in this case you must make this information available before the consumer makes their purchase. And likewise, if you put any of those terms or any other claims on the food on the website, they have to meet the legislation. It's exactly the same thing, and again we would enforce anything that goes online the same way as it would if it was on a physical label in the supermarket. So just very briefly then to look at food marketing with regard to nutrition and health claims, again, just to say that the claims, they're not new, okay? They've been regulated since 2006 because of the fact that we're so much various different, I suppose, suggestions and information put on food labels. There are two different types of claims in Regulation 1924. I had that on an earlier slide. There's either a nutrition claim, so that would be something like contains protein or high in vitamin C. Regulation 1924 lists all of the nutrition claims that you are permitted to use, along with the criteria that goes with each one. If it's not on that list, you're not permitted to use it on your label. The other side is then the health claim, and that's going a little bit more because it's linking the food back to the actual, I suppose, health of the consumer. And again, something like for the protein, it will be contains protein, which contributes to the maintenance of muscle mass. So now you're allowing the consumer know that the reason the protein is here is because it's contributing to maintaining your muscle mass. And that's another key point to say when it comes to marketing food, is that the wording has to be kept fairly close to what the Commission has set in the claim. Because if you go to say that it enhances or increases muscle mass, that's a totally different message to the maintaining. And again, for vitamin C, it contributes to normal collagen formation for the normal functioning of bones. So again, the consumer can relate the nutrient to the health benefit. And this, as I said, is very tightly regulated. You'll see on the EU Register of Claims, if you want to put anything on the food label in terms of a health claim, you need to go to check the register here to search for your food or your nutrient. You will find if the claim is authorized or not. If it's authorized, you can use it. And as I said, you must stick with the actual wording that's permitted. Okay, so I suppose all of this is really bringing us back to wondering, well, what can we say? So this was an old Guinness sign. Some of you will remember it, Guinness for strength. So that was, I suppose, an innocuous marketing tool going back over the years. So again, now because we have nutrition and health claims, we can't actually say this anymore because it's not substantiated. Guinness is not going to provide you with strength. So if we have a look at another example, it's a lovely day for a Guinness and we still have the same image. And again, yes, it possibly is a lovely day for a Guinness, maybe later on. But again, the image that's implying the strength again is a no-no. So again, it's not permitted because it's implying a benefit. So that's another key thing to remember. It's not just your words or your text, it's everything graphically that you put on the food label. But however, this nice one, lovely day for Guinness, there's nothing implied here. So in this particular case, that's fine. So I suppose that just really brings me to the end of what I wanted to cover. I was trying, when I was trying to think out the presentation, I didn't really want to get into the, the nuts and bolts of the labels and what has to be on them and how it looks, but I wanted to be able to just bring it across to see, well, yes, we have the rules. Here are other things that go on food labels and really how it ties together in terms of enforcement. So I'll hand back over to Jackie. Thank you, Jackie.
Thank you very much, Clodagh. Plenty of food for thought there, pardon the pun. I think the next time we look at the labels in the supermarket, we'll be a bit more informed. Certainly that whole issue of, if the chicken is in the chicken curry is Irish, when they're saying the chicken curry is Irish, is an interesting one. Thanks very much for that. So our next speaker is Clare Reynolds from UCD, who is a biomedical scientist and lecturer in human nutrition. Her background, her PhD, is in nutritional immunology. And she's going to just talk to us today, I suppose, particularly about sugar. Initially, she had done a lot of research on meat, cattle fed on grass rather than grain, and how that influenced inflammation in the gut and fatty tissue. And she then did work in New Zealand, where she focused looking on nutrition in pregnancy and how that impacted the health of the mother and the growing baby. And this brought her then to look at high fat, high sugar diets during pregnancy and how that can influence childhood obesity in later life. And when she was working in Auckland, she gained interest in health literacy, was involved in a program, Lend Science, Meet the Scientist, which was about communicating research to high school students. And when she moved back to Ireland, she's now currently an Ad Astro Fellow, Assistant Professor in the School of Public Health, Physiotherapy and Sports Science at UCD, and her research is going to examine the role of sugar and artificial sweeteners on male fertility. So delighted to have you, Clare. Over to you.
Thanks a million, Jackie, and thanks for the invite to come and talk to everyone here today. And thanks for that intro. It kind of was very all-encompassing. So today, I'm going to talk about sugar. And the reason I've titled it Bittersweet is because, as lovely and sweet as sugar is, there are some, harmful effects when we consume it, especially when we consume it in large amounts. So I'll go through a little bit about sugar and what we mean by added sugars, and then I'll talk a little bit about the health effects. But first, I'll just go through a little bit about my background, just so you know where I'm coming from. So as David said, being interested in science from a very early age. It was interesting that he mentioned geology, because geology was my kind of first love when it came to science. My dad is a miner. He used to bring home cores. We used to look for fossils in them. So that was kind of where my science journey began. But I suppose as I got older, I got quite interested in biology, and I went to do biochemistry in UCD. And when I went on to, learning about biochemistry, it's so heavily kind of invested in the biological processes that go on in our bodies from day to day. And nutrition is a really integral part of that. So I went on to do a PhD in nutrition, looking at how certain nutrients can affect the immune system. So as Jackie said, I moved to New Zealand, and it was while I was in New Zealand that I really became interested in sugar. So it was within the context of early life, but the reason sugar was of interest was because New Zealanders consume a lot of sugar. So it's a really big health problem over there. So it's something that we incorporated into our research and something that I've carried through over the last decade or so. So I guess to start off, what do we mean by added sugars? So we know that fruit and things like that and yogurts and milk products all have sugar in them. And if we look at our food labels, as Clodagh mentioned, some of the things that are listed are the sugars in it. And in milk products, they have a lot of the sugar, lactose, but that's not an added sugar. So by added sugar, we mean anything that's added during the production process. Or, if you're adding spoons of sugar to your tea, or you're using honey or syrup on your breakfast cereal, or even concentrated fruit juice. So while fruit itself isn't considered added sugar. It's the fruit. The sugar is kind of in the fruit itself. If you distill that down into a concentrated form, we consider that an added sugar. And I guess when we think of added sugars, we think of, all the, the trappings of a Western diet, our cola drinks, our donuts, our sweets and our biscuits. But sugar is actually found, or added sugars are actually found in quite a wide range of products. And I suppose when I began my sugar journey, I was a bit shocked myself to learn that, some of the products that have quite a considerable amount of added sugar. And we're talking about things like salad dressings, things that we nearly consider as a healthy option, salad dressings, sauces, so like pasta sauces or any kind of tomato-based sauce, fruit juices, sports drinks, all this kind of stuff, and granola bars are a big culprit as well. They all contain quite a considerable amount of added sugar. And it's these kind of hidden sugars, I suppose, that people might not be as aware of as, the typical ones, in our sweets and our biscuits and things like that. And I suppose food companies have become very, very good at not hiding the sugar, but kind of, I suppose, being a little bit disingenuous, not disingenuous, but I suppose hiding the fact that sugars in things. There's a whole range of different names for sugar. They're all essentially the same thing. They're all sugar at the end of the day. But I mean, this is just a small example of the things that sugar is called. And some of them, I suppose, you nearly mistake for being a health food product, things like beet sugar or rice sugar. Beets are healthy, rice is healthy, but it's essentially the sugar that's derived from these things. And at the end of the day, it is sugar. And it's the same kind of idea and the same health effects as what you would get from your spoon of sugar in your tea. So I suppose if you are thinking of cutting out sugar and reducing sugar in your diet, understanding the way that sugar is labeled is really critical to actually being able to cut it out. Because often terms like this, like corn syrup solids or different types of names have been attributed to sugar. So it might not be immediately obvious that it is sugar that's in the product. So I suppose the next thing to look at is how much do Irish people consume, and is that a problem? So I found this when I was doing my search, and I quite enjoyed it because, I consumed the odd fizzy drink myself. I don't know if I'd agree fully with the God tier things. I think Club Lemon should definitely be in there, but Irish people love their fizzy drinks. They're very pervasive in Irish food consumption. And when you actually break it down and look at the OECD rankings of countries that consume sugary drinks, Ireland actually features second in that list, excuse me, and only second to the United States. So we are really high consumers of these types of fizzy drinks. So, and that's not even considering the other sources of added sugar that we have, And I suppose when we're talking about sugar, we have to consider the fact that I suppose our culture has changed quite considerably over the last maybe 20 years or so. The Celtic Tiger kind of brought around, a bit of an upsurge in things like cafe culture. Whereas, that might not have been the case before. And when you're going out for your cup of coffee, there's often quite a nice range of delicious pastries and things like that on offer as well. And, a lot of us would, grab our coffee and maybe grab a scone or, a muffin or something as well at the same time. So, this kind of change in culture has contributed quite considerably to our increased sugar intakes over the last several decades. So that's something to consider as well when we're talking about sugar consumption in Ireland and I suppose Europe in general. So I suppose it's important to know what the actual recommendations are, and the WHO have been quite clear about their recommendations in terms of this is added sugar consumption as well. So their added sugar recommendations stand as 5 to 10 teaspoons for an adult, no more than 5 teaspoons a day for a child. And quite recently, they've changed the guidelines for under 3s, and now they recommend 0 added sugars for under 3s. And the rule of thumb generally is that you shouldn't consume any more than 10% of your caloric intake from an added sugar. So it's very straightforward. And I suppose the next thing to look at is, do we kind of abide by that? Is that something that's I suppose Irish people actually kind of abide by. And no is definitely the answer to that. So for an adult in Ireland, the average consumption of added sugar is 25 teaspoons. For children, it's about 15, and for the under 3s, it's 5 to 10. So we certainly do have quite considerably high intakes of sugar in this country. And the reason for that really is because there's so much sugar in our diet, like, you know, everything has sugar in it, as I mentioned before. And if we look at what 5 or 10 spoons of sugar actually looks like in real life, you know, it's kind of shocking, really. Like, you know, a can of Coke has 10 spoonfuls of sugar. So you drink a can of Coke and that's your added sugar intake for the day. And as I mentioned, there's quite a lot of sugar in a lot of products that you might not necessarily expect. So things like products that have, say, 0% sugar or 0% fat claims, they often have sugar. I mean, you know, the things that make food tasty are generally sugar and fat. So if it's missing one, it's probably got the other in it. So 0% fat products often have quite a high sugar content. And if it's not sugar content, it's usually artificial sweetener content. Things like pasta sauces are big culprits for high kind of sugar content. And obviously breakfast cereals to a certain extent. I mean, I suppose it's not shocking that Frosties would have 4 teaspoons per bowl, but, you know, I suppose that's another contributor, is breakfast cereals tend to have quite a high amount of sugar in them. And, you know, drinks, sports drinks and things like that also are very high culprits. And I suppose the thing that I suppose it's a bit of a bugbear of mine is the amount of sugar in children's food. I know in New Zealand, the Plunket, or the agency that kind of administers early life visits, are sponsored by Watties, which is a food company. And they would often recommend some of these pouches that are available for children who are weaning. But they're so high in sugar. Like, a lot of them, you know, any of the ones that have fruit in them basically are going to have seriously high sugar content. Like you can see here from the table here that, like, some of them have up to 8 teaspoons of sugar, which is, you know, well above what a child should have. And especially when you're considering that the under 3s are the kind of prime target for these kind of foodstuffs. So it is quite a big problem in terms of childhood sugar intakes. So I hope this kind of illustrates that, like, you know, while we're recommended to only take 5 or 10 spoonfuls of sugar, it's so pervasive in our food chain that it's really difficult to actually adhere to that. And most people don't even realize that they're intaking such a high amount of sugar. So that kind of brings me to the, like, more biological side of things, like, what does sugar actually do to your body? So there are claims floating around that sugar is addictive. These are, you know, based in some reality. So it's never been definitively shown in humans. There are certain criteria that you need to meet to I suppose, fulfill the addiction criteria. And I suppose it's not been definitively shown in a scientific study that is the case, but it has been shown in rodents. So studies in mice and rats have shown that it activates the areas of the brain that are involved in reward and addiction. So I'm not going to go too in depth into it. Neurobiology is not my particular area, and it can get quite complex quite quick. So I shy away from it. But essentially, sugar activates what's called the dopamine pathways. So dopamine is just a protein in your brain that sparks off when you intake something, and it's basically in response to things like reward or motivation, so pleasure, you know, compulsion and things like that. So, you know, it's the area of the brain that would be sparked off in terms of, say, cocaine addiction and things like that. So sugar does activate that area of the brain. So in that way, you know, it can be classed as potentially addictive. So there are some indications that sugar has addictive properties. So that's something to consider when you're giving up sugar, I suppose. But I suppose there's this kind of cycle, you know, in terms of sugar kind of consumption. And basically what happens is, you know, you eat your sugar, tastes nice, activates those areas of your brain. Then what you get is an increase in insulin, which clears so you get a spike in blood glucose, which activates a protein called insulin. This clears the blood sugar from your body. Then you have a dip in sugar. So this is what we call the sugar crash. So you have this drop in blood sugar levels, and then you start to kind of get a bit tired and low. You start getting hunger and cravings, because your blood sugar is low. This then increases your appetite and your cravings, and then you say, I love another bar of chocolate, and off you go again, and it's the continuous cycle. So from this perspective, sugar definitely has effects in the brain and can be classed as a potentially addictive substance, although that has not definitively been shown, I guess. But there's multiple effects throughout the body in relation to sugar. I suppose the big ones are on our metabolic health. So organs like the liver. So when the liver receives too much sugar in a short space of time, what it does is it actually converts that to fat. And that can contribute to conditions such as fatty liver disease, which kind of can go on to have serious consequences for your liver health and your overall metabolic health. And it's one of the factors that can contribute to type 2 diabetes. And when we're talking about type 2 diabetes, you know, the pancreas is an organ that's really important for that. So it's the organ that actually secretes insulin. And when we're getting these big spikes in insulin after eating sugar, it puts a lot of pressure on the pancreas. And over time, that can build and build, and that can cause serious effects on the pancreas, which can lead to type 2 diabetes. You know, I've mentioned the brain already. There's some, you know, there's addictive properties in terms of sugar. The kidneys is another organ that could be affected, where, you know, too much blood sugar can then spill into the urine, and that can cause quite considerable damage to your kidneys. You know, there's also effects on you know, your fertility in terms of high sugar levels, and even your skin. So sugar actually has quite a considerable amount of negative effects on the body. So certainly limiting your sugar intake is essential for kind of maintaining a healthy body. And just because it's my area and I'm quite interested in it, I'll just touch very, very lightly on sugar and early life. So there's quite a considerable amount of evidence now, and some of that's from work that we've done ourselves. And it shows that if you consume a large amount of either sugar or even artificial sweeteners during pregnancy, that can have a range of effects, not only in the mother, where you see you know, an increase in the likelihood of developing pregnancy complications such as gestational diabetes or increased weight gain. You can also have effects on the growing baby. And this essentially amounts to kind of an increase in BMI in the child as he or she grows. So there's associations, and there's also some associations with preterm birth and sugar consumption as well. So there are some quite negative effects kind of during the pregnancy stage if there's a lot of sugar consumed during pregnancy. And even if you're exposed early in life, and this can be while breastfeeding, so fructose goes through the breast milk and can be, you know, delivered to the baby by that way, or even just early life sugar consumption, kind of, you know, anywhere from toddlerhood up to kind of adolescence, can have a range of different effects on the body. And I'm not going to go into some of these, like, so the gut microbiota, so they're all the bacteria that live in your gut, and they're essential for health and keeping your body healthy. They can be affected, and your appetite can be affected, and your taste preference can be affected if you've been exposed to sugar early in life. And all these lead to an increase in the likelihood that you become obese later in life. So there are some quite negative consequences in terms of sugar consumption in the early life period. So cutting out sugar in that category is really important for maintaining, I suppose, a healthy population in general. You know, we're seeing increased childhood obesity. So, you know, one of the ways that we could potentially act to, you know, cut that back is making sure people reduce their sugar intake early in life. And I suppose when you think of sugar, something that's kind of, I suppose, become a very kind of popular topic over the last maybe decade or so is sugar taxes. And Ireland introduced a sugar tax in 2018. So there's kind of limited evidence for sugar tax being effective. And the reason for that is because really they're not around long enough that we can kind of gain enough reliable data over a long period of time to judge whether or not they've been effective. Specifically in terms of health claims, you know, you need to kind of look at maybe a 5 or 10 year period. We don't have enough information right now in terms of population, the kind of association between population obesity reduction and sugar taxes, but hopefully over the next decade or so, we'll get that kind of information coming through. So in Ireland, they've introduced a sugar tax. So it's generated over 30 million in revenue in the first year. So that's good for the exchequer, I suppose. And you would hope that the government are funneling that money into obesity prevention measures and things like that. But yeah. So last year it was actually down 2 million in revenue, and whether that's, you know, people being a bit more conscientious in terms of their diet during COVID, or I don't know, but it certainly is a good sign that people are reducing their intakes of these sugary drinks. But just to highlight it again, it's not just sugary drinks. Sugary drinks account for about 1/3 of the added sugars that we get in our diet. So there's another 2/3 out there that, you know, possibly are not being affected. And just to highlight, we're not the only country that have introduced sugar tax. They've become more and more popular throughout the world, and there's you know, a considerable amount of countries now who have implemented them. And I've just kind of cherry picked 3. So Mexico was one of the first that kind of brought this in. They had a really promising start where they saw, I think it was a 6% decrease in sugar drink sales in the first year. So it started off quite well, but it's bounced back a bit now. It's still less than it had been, and the sugar drink industry seems to have slowed down a wee bit. But it's certainly not kind of maintaining the trajectory that it had kind of at the outset. So from that point of view, I suppose it's a bit mixed. We don't know whether or not it's having the desired effect yet. The French one seems to be having an impact. Again, it was introduced recently, so time will tell whether or not it's effective. But I suppose the one that kind of springs to mind is the first place in the States that introduced sugar tax was the city of Berkeley in California. And within the first year, they saw a 40% drop in sales. And along with that, they saw increase in 63% in water consumption via the kind of city water rates in low socioeconomic groups. So kind of the poorer neighborhoods seem to be drinking more water, which indicates that maybe they're drinking water because they're not drinking the fizzy drinks. So there are some signs that the sugar taxes are having a benefit, but I suppose we can't definitively say that for another while data is generated in terms of, you know, obesity rates and their association with the sugar taxes. It'll be a little bit of time before we can actually make a true judgment on whether or not they're effective in terms of tackling obesity and things like that. And there are factors that we do have to consider with the sugar tax. You know, people may not be drinking their sugary beverages. They might be going for an artificial sweetener beverage, like a diet beverage instead. They might be getting their sugar elsewhere, or they might be going for a cheaper alternative, you know, that might have been the same cost as their original kind of choice. And another thing that I suppose is a bit worrying is a lot of the drinks companies then absorb the cost of the tax, so that there's not a massive increase in the amount that the consumer actually pays. So there's some factors that kind of I suppose are causing a bit of kind of, you know, which kind of negate the positive effects of the sugar taxes. But it's kind of one of those kind of wait and see, and hopefully it will have an effect. So in a talk about sugar, I suppose it would be remiss of me not to just very briefly touch on artificial sweeteners, because they are I suppose one of the main alternatives to sugary kind of beverages. There are numerous artificial sweeteners out there. I suppose the most popular ones, certainly in terms of Irish consumption, are sulfame K, which I suppose a lot of people haven't heard of, and aspartame, which people probably a bit more familiar for people like. And then there's a range of other ones, from saccharin, sucralose, and some of the newer ones like neotame. They're essentially, you know, anywhere from 100 to, you know, 20,000 times the sweetness of normal sugar. So, you know, you can add a very small amount of these and they'll still have this massively potent sweetness effect. So they act in a number of ways. They obviously don't have calories, but they still initiate that, you know, sweet taste. So basically when you consume them, they activate proteins in your tongue, and that sends a loop to your brain to tell your brain that you're receiving sweetness. But they also act on numerous different organs. So they act in the gut, they act in your pancreas. There's a whole range of effects that they have. You know, and they're thought to impact a wide range of organs in a similar way to normal sugar. Actually, one thing that I thought was quite interesting, because they pass through your body relatively unchanged, You can measure them in wastewater treatment plants, and it can get a gauge of how much sweeteners people are actually consuming. But one side effect of this is because it's kind of pervasive in our water supply, it has quite a negative effect on our fish populations. So I thought that was quite interesting that's kind of going on. So again, Irish people do drink a lot of fizzy drinks, and they drink a lot of diet colas, and this has increased, since the introduction of the sugar tax. We're very high consumers of these artificial sweeteners. And again, like sugar, it's hidden in a range of different things. So you probably wouldn't expect it. I mean, like a lot of toothpaste, the reason it's sweet is because it has sweeteners in it. Chewing gums, Calpol, like infant medications, and things like the energy drinks like Barocca and things like that, they would all have sweeteners in them. But they're not as innocuous as we might expect. So they have been associated with a range of negative health effects, including weight gain, type 2 diabetes, stroke and heart disease, and things like that. So they're not necessarily the best option in terms of an alternative to sugar, because they do have quite a number of significant health effects. So it's just to touch on that, and just to show that, sweetener, or, the sweeteners might not be the best alternative to sugar when you're considering cutting sugar out of your diet, because they do have negative health impacts. So just to finish off, I thought I'm not a dietitian. So, if you are thinking of cutting out sugar and you want kind of professional help, my advice would be to contact a dietitian. But just from my perspective and my kind of trying to cut sugar out of my diet journey, I thought I'd kind of give some of my tips, I suppose. And the first one is to go easy on yourself, because it's really difficult. It's in so much of our food chain that it takes a lot of effort to cut down or cut out, and it's one step at a time. Whether it's cutting out fizzy drinks out of your diet, or stop, slowly reducing the amount of sugar you put in your tea or coffee, those kind of steps, little steps can be beneficial too. So I mean, go easy on yourself and do it one step at a time if you're not comfortable with kind of going cold turkey. So as I said, avoiding artificial sweeteners is probably a good idea, because they're not necessarily any healthier than typical sugars. Knowledge is power. Knowing what the sugars are, that there's different names for sugars, and that there's a range of different things that they can be called in food products, as well as knowing the different sources of added sugars in our food chain, is really key to being able to cut down and cut out sugar in your diet. And I suppose identifying healthy alternatives. Instead of having, a fruit juice, maybe have an orange, I know that's easier said than done, but identifying kind of, recipes online. There's lots of recipes online for, healthy alternatives that don't include the same level of sugar. And these are all kind of, I suppose where I've come from in my journey of cutting out sugar, although I've not succeeded in that yet. So hopefully over the next few years, I'll get it down to zero. But yeah, it is a very hard journey to cut it out completely from your diet. So I just want to thank everyone for listening. It's been an absolute pleasure being able to share this information with you.
Thanks very much, Clare. That was very interesting. We're certainly going to be checking out the sugar labels now, as well as everything else. And no, really, really interesting, really helpful. I just want to acknowledge, I think there was a couple of questions in the chat. So just to say that I know one or two of them have been answered already. And just to say that after Anne's talk, we're going to take a short break, and then we're going to go into some breakout rooms where we're going to have a couple of questions to discuss ourselves, and then we'll come back as a group and everyone's microphones will be unmuted. So we'll be able to talk and discuss and address those questions directly with each of the speakers. So with that, we're just going to finally now go to Anne Doyle, who is a research officer in the Health Research Board. She works as an alcohol researcher there, which involves updating the national alcohol surveillance figures and providing the Department of Health with information about the alcohol situation in Ireland to help them to make decisions. So today she's going to talk to us about the findings of a recent report published on the Health Research Board on alcohol use in Ireland and the consequences. And just to say as well that Aoife has just dropped into the chat there as well a link that if you want to put in any of your questions or comments, you can put them all in that link there, and we'll be able to see them all and come back and then talk them through together as a group when we're back together again. So thanks very much, Anne. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. Can you see my slides there?
Yeah, all good.
Yep, sorry, I had put them over you, Jackie. Sorry about that. So thank you for that, Jackie, and thanks to Midland Science for inviting me to speak here today. I am going to talk about alcohol use, alcohol harm, and policy implications in Ireland. The Health Research Board, which is where I work, is a state agency. We work under the Department of Health, and part of our role in the HRB is to publish these overviews on the alcohol situation in Ireland. So about how much we drink, the way we drink, and the consequences of our alcohol use. And that information then is used to inform the Department of Health, and in turn then informs alcohol policy. So what do we drink here in Ireland? We drink this is 2019 stats, so we drink on average 10.8 litres of pure alcohol per person aged 15 years and over in any 1 year. So 10.8 litres doesn't mean much to most people. So what that means in terms of actual drinks is it's on average every person over 15 drinking 40 bottles of vodka in a year, 113 bottles of wine, or 436 pints of beer. And in fact, those figures refer to everyone. That would be assuming that everyone in Ireland drinks, but we actually have about a quarter of the population who don't drink, so the numbers are actually much higher. It's roughly about 53 bottles of vodka per year, which is one a week, 149 bottles of wine, or 574 pints of beer. So it's a lot.
Sorry, just to say, your slides aren't actually changing on our end.
Oh.
So you're still stuck on the same slide.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no problem. Yes, there you are. You're perfect now. That's
so
right.
This is what we're drinking. Sorry, so you couldn't see this one. Okay, so just to summarize again, this is on average what every person in Ireland drinks in an average year, every person aged 15 years and over. So it's always interesting to know how we rank and how we compare to other countries. And we are unfortunately in the top 10. So we're the 9th highest per capita of alcohol consumption among OECD member countries. And we're the 8th highest in terms of our monthly binge drinking. To look at our patterns of drinking, in the Health Research Board, we periodically publish, we carry out these drug and alcohol surveys. And in the most recent one, we found that about a quarter of the population don't drink at all, and 3/4 then do drink. And of the 3/4 who do drink alcohol, over half would be classified as harmful drinkers. This would mean that they're drinking a lot and a lot in one sitting. And males, young males, would be most likely to drink in this harmful drinking pattern. 1 in 5 drinkers, about 20%, are classified as having an alcohol use disorder. So we can see from that harmful drinking patterns are the norm in Ireland, and drinking is embedded in Irish culture. We are any social event, most social events, from religious ones, communions, christenings, funerals, even weekends, alcohol is a huge part of our culture. So how it affects our bodies: alcohol is classed as a legal sedative drug in that it depresses the central nervous system when it's consumed at high quantities. Once consumed, it travels from the mouth, obviously, through to the stomach, into the circulatory system, the blood, into the brain, kidneys, lungs, and liver. So it really is spreading throughout your body. And at low levels, any of you who've had a glass or two will know that it acts as a stimulant. It induces feelings of relaxation, euphoria, impulsivity, and talkativeness. At high levels, then, it can impair coordination and judgment, lead to drowsiness, respiratory depression. This would be whereby the breathing becomes slow, shallow, or stops entirely. And then it could lead to coma or death. Alcohol impairs your memory, so you may struggle to remember what happened when you were drunk. So because of the evidence of alcohol-related harm, the World Health Organization, the WHO, advised that we drink moderately. And these are the guidelines. They're tailored in Ireland. The HSE tailored these guidelines for Irish drinkers, because you'll notice that in some countries, particularly say the UK, they use the term units, but here in Ireland we use one standard drink. And what one standard drink means is 10 grams of pure alcohol. And again, that most drinks aren't measured by 10 grams of pure alcohol, but what a standard drink is a half a pint of beer, it's 100 mils of wine, or one pub measure of spirits of 35 mils. So that in particular, the wine there, just to note that 100 mils of wine is a standard drink. And in fact, in your average bottle of wine, there should be 7.5 glasses per bottle. And I know, you know, nowadays our wine glasses are getting bigger and bigger all the time, and especially when we're drinking at home, where we tend to over pour. So it's just to be mindful that a standard drink is 100 mils. It's smaller, I think, than what we think. The HSE guidelines are that we don't drink any more than 11 standard drinks per week for women, or 17 standard drinks for men. The drinks should be spread out over the course of the week, and you should aim to have 2 to 3 alcohol-free days per week, and no more than 6 standard drinks on any one occasion. When you drink more than 6 standard drinks, you're getting into what's termed binge drinking or heavy episodic drinking. So alcohol-related harm is determined by both the overall volume of alcohol consumed and the pattern of drinking. So it's not just about how much we're drinking, but how we drink. So when we drink in that hazardous pattern, which, as I say, is the heavy episodic or binge drinking, and the mechanisms by which alcohol may cause harm are the toxic effects on organs. This would be through cumulative alcohol consumption, where you've been drinking for many years, and the effects on your liver and other organs. Harm is also through intoxication. So this would be alcoholic poisoning or injuries because of being intoxicated. And then dependence, where an individual may lead to being dependent on alcohol, leading to impairments in behavior. If you drink in a binge drinking manner, or if you're dependent on alcohol, you're between 5 and 13 times more likely to experience alcohol-related harm. So in measuring health harms, we look at alcohol-related hospitalization. So we're able to look at HYPE data, which is information about discharges from Irish hospitals in terms of, it captures every discharge, but we can look at alcohol-related discharges. And over the course of a year, this data is 2018, there are over 40,000 discharges from hospital due to alcohol-related conditions. In particular then, just looking at this, there's about 3,500 cases annually of discharges for alcoholic liver disease. And we know too that the average length of stay for an alcohol-related condition is 10 days, which is almost double that for a non-alcohol related condition, which is showing us that alcohol conditions are more complex to treat, and they're taking longer to treat, because even when we look back at 20, 30 years ago, it was half this time. So it is taking longer to treat the alcohol-related conditions. This graph just looks at alcoholic liver disease discharges from the hospitals. And we can see here, starting back at 1995, this steady upwards trajectory of alcoholic liver disease over the period of time. And all of this is directly related to our levels of alcohol consumption. And what's not shown in this, but what's important to note, is that in these statistics, there's an increasing number of women and young people represented with alcoholic liver disease. And, you know, back in the 90s, it would have been tended to be the majority were older male long-term drinkers, but this combination now of heavy episodic binge drinking and the increasing number of women drinking are represented in these figures, so that's of concern. And in terms of alcohol and the link with cancer, when we drink it, alcohol is a carcinogen, and when we drink alcohol, it's converted into an enzyme which it's converted, by an enzyme into a carcinogen called acetaldehyde. I have to write that down. And what that does is it's a carcinogen, and as you're drinking the alcohol, it is touching the cells in your mouth and into your neck, and that's cancer causing. And in terms of breast cancer, it increases the levels of female hormone of estrogen, and that can lead to cancer as well. So around 1,000 cases of cancer diagnosed every year are caused by alcohol, and that's 10% of cancers in men and 3% in women. We know that 1 in 10 breast cancers are due to alcohol, and even low levels of alcohol consumption, so just over 1 standard drink per day for a woman, can increase a woman's risk of breast cancer. And unfortunately, the public awareness of these alcohol-related conditions, particularly the link between breast cancer, it's quite, it's not very well known, and that's of concern. So a survey that was carried out found that there was good awareness between knowledge of the link between alcohol and liver disease, but when it came to knowledge of the link between alcohol and breast cancer, was only at 21% were aware, and included in those it was a very low awareness amongst women as well. So that would really be of concern, and I'd be interested to hear when you're in your breakout rooms whether it was something that you were aware of yourselves. And I suppose the price that we're paying as well, or the bottom line, is that 3 people die every single day due to alcohol related causes. And we know that the majority of these, so 2 in every 3, are under 65 years, and that represents premature deaths. And we have that information through the National Drug Related Deaths Index, which is a database on drug and alcohol related deaths that we house in the Health Research Board. So say in one particular year, in 2017, which is the last available data, 4% of all deaths in Ireland were alcohol related. That was over 1,000 deaths. So what this means is that, you know, alcohol is a public health issue, and the evidence that's been fed back to the Department of Health, as I say, it feeds into the policies that are enacted. And in 2018, the Public Health Alcohol Act was enacted, and it has now become, I've just included a few images here to talk you through. So it's now actually illegal for, if you're in the cinema, if your film is an under 18s, it's illegal to show an ad for an alcohol product. It's illegal for children's wear to bear the logo of an alcohol brand. You can't have alcohol advertising at bus stops or public transport, or within 200 meters of playgrounds or schools or creches. Alcohol promotions are now illegal as well, in that you can't have these happy hour or buy one get one free, or you might have noticed in supermarkets you can't use your points, and they can't be used towards alcohol products. And this one here is about structural separation, where alcohol products are, supermarkets and smaller shops as well are obliged to keep alcohol products out of view from, and the intended is that it's out of view from children. Children shouldn't be able to see alcohol as an ordinary commodity, so it has to be kept kind of behind closed doors. A component of the Act that's due to be enacted in January 2022 after Christmas is minimum unit pricing. And what this refers to is that it's a minimum price per gram that alcohol can be sold at. And it doesn't affect pubs or clubs. Obviously, they're well above these prices. It's targeting the cheapest alcohol that you'll find in supermarkets. And essentially what that means is that the minimum price for, we'll say, your average bottle of wine will be €7.50. It'll be €1.97 minimum for a can of lager, or €20.71 for a bottle of gin and spirits. And the idea behind minimum unit pricing is that it targets those heaviest drinkers, the ones who have the most to gain because their drinking is very harmful to their health. So it's about 14% of all drinkers. And our minimum unit pricing has been brought in a number of jurisdictions, including Canada and our neighbours Scotland. They would have had a similar rate of alcohol-related deaths as we do, because of a similar rate population and a similar relationship with alcohol. And this graph just shows how they introduced minimum unit pricing in 2018, and they immediately saw over 10% drop in alcohol-related deaths. But they also saw, which was not shown in this, they also saw a decrease in crime, in hospitalization and in spending on alcohol as well. So it's had a huge impact, a hugely positive impact in Scotland. And just very briefly here, showing how price increases does impact on alcohol consumption. This is just a graph showing our steady kind of increasing alcohol use. This was how much we were drinking, we'll say, and you can see there back in the mid-90s, as we began to have a bit more disposable income, our consumption levels went up and up and up. You can see dips whenever there was a tax increase. It dipped again when there was a tax increase or tax decrease. Then we can see consumption went up. So minimum unit pricing is intended to reduce our overall consumption levels. And I was very interested to hear Clodagh, this morning talking about labeling on products, because you can see how strict it is for food products, and yet the same rules don't seem to apply for alcohol products, or to date they haven't. So this is one component of the Public Health Alcohol Act that hasn't been enacted yet. We're at least 3 years waiting for it, but hopefully it will come in. I've just used an example here of how labeling on alcoholic products should look in the future if this part of the Act comes into effect. So what it would mean that just basically a label on your alcoholic product to inform of the danger of alcohol consumption, about the dangers of drinking when pregnant, the direct link between alcohol and cancers, the quantity of grams of alcohol in the container, the energy value of the alcohol in the container, and a link to a website providing public health information. So that would be a HSE, a non-alcohol industry funded website. So it would be a HSE one providing advice on drinking. And so that's something that we're really pushing to be enacted, or it is enacted, but it just needs to be rolled out. And it will be, I think, it's not about, it's about informing people about what they're consuming, and that would be a good one to have in place. So that was a whistle-stop tour through a very big report on alcohol use in Ireland. But as you can see, we drink a lot in Ireland, and we're not really getting away with it. The effects of our alcohol use, they're harmful. We're drinking in patterns. We're a nation of binge drinkers, and with the high alcohol consumption and the binge drinking patterns, we really are putting a huge impact on our health. It's responsible for a considerable burden of health harm. You can see from the hospital statistics that there are a lot of hospitalizations. There's a high rate of death as well. And in our attempt, in the government's attempt to, get us to drink less and to have a positive impact on our health, the Public Health Alcohol Act aims to improve the health of Irish people by reducing overall consumption, as well as targeting the heavy drinkers and targeting the harmful drinking patterns. So there was a lot of information, as I say, in that, but if you're looking for more, if you have any questions for me, happy to take any questions. But the HSE website, Ask About Alcohol, there's a lot of information. The low risk guidelines are there on the HSE website as well. And the HRB website has a link to the full report. So thank you very much for your attention this morning.